past season, right? Like there isn't that star player really. And on defense, I mean, you have Jack Mattier, who was a fourth round pick for Nashville. It's just there's so little experience, but it also leaves the door open for players to step up into that role because you're going to have players that won't have had the opportunity on other teams that will have it here to really step in. So one of those players that I'm going to keep an eye on is Luca Pinelli, who's the younger brother of Francesco Pinelli, who was a second round pick this year, who should have gone in the first round. That extremely intelligent forward, and Francesco that is, and Luca Pinelli is apparently also like his hockey IQ, his competitiveness, and his skill are really what drives him as a centerman. And so I'm going to keep an eye on him because he is not going to be a player that's available in this upcoming draft, but he's still a year younger. So he's in the 2023 draft. But you're going to see a lot of very young players have some potential to step up. So just to wrap up the question, Patrick,
No worries,
it's about building a team also through maybe like unconventional methods and having a really good scouting department, right? So for undrafted players, like for instance, like Josh Anderson was never drafted in the OHL. And he just like he had some connections with the London Knights and they gave him a tryout, and then he played on like probably one of those dominant junior teams in recent memory, the London Knights that had also Christian Dvorak, Max Domi, Mitch Marner,
have you heard
Matthew Tkachuk, all these star players, right? And Josh Anderson was in that core. So it's also about scouting. It's a huge mix of things, similar to the NHL, where you also have scouts, you also have management, you have respect, you have all these things. But it's just where like the time span, instead of being like you're looking 10 years ahead, you're looking like 2 years ahead because you're constantly losing your players when they graduate to the NHL or whatever other pro league.
I think the bottom line though is like I think you nailed it right there with your final sentence. You know, you're looking 2 years ahead rather than 10 years ahead. And I think this is where player development becomes so important. And this is where NHL teams can really learn something. I'm not going to name a particular team because I think we all know those tricolors and the way they've handled the last couple of first round picks. But Scott, you wanted to interject and give a little comment before we move on to something else.
The comment that Sebastian made about the cycle of junior is probably one of the most key defining aspects of any junior team. Get a bunch of really talented players, really high-end players that get picked in the NHL draft, and then your team has to start from scratch in essence, and you keep building like that. Going back to what he said about the Ottawa 67s, the Ottawa 67s have an built inconsistency. Their head coach was Brian Kilry, who coached for 32 seasons for the team. The 67s have a reputation for that kind of thing, and they've, as he said, they've been one of the most dominant teams in junior over the past few seasons with head coach Andre Tourigny.
Did I hear that properly, Scott? 32 seasons?
32 seasons, and
good Lord.
Score of the first goal in LA Kings history, might I add.
Oh, nice.
But I definitely think that that thing that you said about sort of the cycle and building players will definitely come to hurt the 67s come next season, but they do have a lot of really talented players that are coming through the ranks. It's just that if you want to make a comparison, you can think about how the WHA in the NHL used to work when Mike Bossy was picked in the first round by the New York Islanders and the fifth round by the Cincinnati Stingers. It kind of ties in that same aspect where we'll just throw a pick at a guy and we'll see how they go. So going into next season, it'll be interesting to see how one of the junior hockey's most consistent teams will deal with new adversity and, most importantly, younger players.
All right, Scott and Sebastian, thank you so much for this segment. I mean, this is definitely going to shape up to be a very interesting draft, and we will definitely be talking more about it in probably every episode until the end of the season. But guys, once again, thank you very much for a great segment. Much appreciated. And now to wrap up this really big show, there was a little comment that was made at the beginning about the center line of the Montreal Canadiens, or the middle line, call it what you want. We were talking about losing Philip Danault, losing Jesperi Kotkaniemi, replacing it with Christian Dvorak, and I guess in some capacity Jake Evans and whatever other free agent we got in Mathieu Perreault, like Paquette and whatnot. But now there has been some report, and this is also the time of the year where we're a couple of weeks away from training camp, where professional tryouts are handed over. Now, PTOs, to use a shorter term. Now, PTOs are given to players with, essentially as, well, like the title says, it's a tryout. You go to training camp, you work your butt off, and you hopefully get a contract. Now, there has been some notable players in the past, who had professional tryouts for the Canadiens. Joel Ward was one of them. If I barely remembered that. Alexander Semin, Simon Després, Eric Gélina, Thomas Fleischmann was one who, we managed to flip for Philip Danault and Alexander Romanov. So I think that ended up being a pretty cool trade. But Sebastian Iskokau and Joshua Rosa is back with us for this segment. I'm going to start with you, Josh. Do you, on your list, maybe see a player, more than another being like, you know what, the Canadiens might be a better team if we maybe not just give a PTO, but maybe just straight up sign a player? Because I think the theme of tonight was we need a little help from our friends. What do you think?
Well, we keep talking about centers, and that's the common theme throughout this whole podcast so far when talking about Montreal. I think the big one would be Tyler Bozak. He can play for, he won the cup, I'm pretty sure, in St. Louis a few years ago, and he's scored 30 points pretty consistently, except for last year, of course, in the shortened season. And you could just never have too much center depth, in my opinion. He could be like a Thomas Fleischmann, who he came in on a PTO, got signed for the team, and he played pretty well. 10 goals, 10 assists, 20 points in 57 games, which is pretty good for a PTO. And then he was also traded with Dale Weiss for, of course, Philip Danault and Alexander Romanov, which is great. Hopefully, if we sign Bozak, we won't have to sell all our assets to teams making the playoffs as we're tanking. But I could see Tyler Bozak being a really good addition to the team.
I absolutely agree. The name of Tyler Bozak has showed up more than once recently in the news as a potential PTO candidate. One thing I appreciate the most about him, I mean, despite him being a former Toronto Maple Leaf, whatever, he's shown consistency his entire career. He's just, he's a good guy in the locker room. He's good. He can be decent on the face-off dot. He's good all over the ice and everything. He's a good teammate to get to have. And I think having a guy like him on the third or even fourth line, it could be positive. But again, the question remains is that, technically you already have your four centermen, in Dvorak, Suzuki, Evans, and Paquette, for that matter, or Paquette / Perreault / Paling. So does adding another centerman actually make sense, or should we be maybe looking at maybe more depth on defense? Because, and Scott, I'll let you have the next comment on this. Is having Brett Kulak enough of only, he's basically our depth on defense along with Romanov, and he's going to be switching around with Chris Weidman and everything. Maybe should we aim for a guy like Sami Vatanen or something, or is really, okay, we really do need help down the middle?
I definitely think that on defense right now, I definitely think that we have enough depth, at least in my own opinion, with Kulak and Weidman. Chris Weidman has enough offensive upside to kind of complement Kulak's more defensive 2A game. But in regard to being on center, I definitely think that adding to our team if he was willing to come to Montreal. And he's a guy who's played really well over the past few seasons. And like Sami Vatanen, he leaves me scratching my head as to why I wonder why so many teams have passed up on him. There's a number of factors, obviously, that play into that. But I still think that Bozak is a really intriguing addition for the Canadiens. And there's already been a few PTOs that have been signed already in the NHL. Brian Boyle going to the Pittsburgh Penguins. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think he has a good chance at earning a contract, whether it remains to be seen. And I don't think that adding a guy like Bozak would just sort of give us a nice fallback option in case things kind of fluctuate or things change or injuries come up. And that's definitely what happened with Corey Perry. We signed Corey Perry to be kind of a depth option. Things ended up changing, and Perry ended up taking a much more substantial role of the team, which he flourished in. So I don't think that PTOs and, in essence, close to training camp contracts can have some really good results come out of them. And I think that Tyler Bozak could be one such option.
Yeah, I always like the kind of throwaways at the end of the off season. You know, you're getting like, a 38-year-old former Cup winner, whatever, who grinded his whole career and was just kind of just hanging on and everything. And Scott, like you mentioned that perfectly in Corey Perry. You know, this is a guy who we thought was going to retire, and the next thing you know, he gave us a great off season, especially at always to go. Try and win with the enemy, which is Tampa Bay. If you can't beat him, join him, I guess. Sebastian, do you have anyone on top of your list that you would love Montreal to maybe give a shot to?
Well, Tyler Bozak and Sami Vatanen both are probably at the top of my list. I've got two other names in here that I think would be pretty interesting. So one of those would be a player that I wouldn't necessarily want Montreal to go after, but someone that would be a very Montreal move would be Jason Demers. Also but
we didn't spend all this time not mentioning Galchenyuk, and there we go.
I thought we were going to survive without it, but
nope.
Yeah. So Jason Demers is actually a free agent, and
surprisingly, no,
right? Like he's a pretty established defensive defenseman, right? Like he's what, 33 years old now. He made $4.5 million last year. But he just hasn't gotten anyone. No one's actually gone for him yet. Like apparently, like the Oilers were talking to him about a PTO, but it's the Oilers, so you never know with Ken Holland. And it'd be a very Montreal move of just getting a veteran defensive defenseman to just provide some competition in camp, right? So like you have like Brett Kulak and Chris Weidman competing for a spot with Matthias Norlinder, who Mac Bergevin was saying will have a legit shot at making the team. And if you want to go for a reach, I guess Josh Brook is technically in the mix, but that would be kind of shocking. And the second player I was looking at is a really weird one. So a UFA that hasn't been scooped up yet is actually a 25-year-old, which is not usual because he was an RFA that was not qualified. And that would be Ryan Donato. So this is a player who has put up.
I'm very curious to hear this one because man, that is a stretch. Go for it.
Is it now? So he put up 20 points in 50 games for San Jose last season, and he's 25 years old. So that on its own, so it was 6 goals and 14 assists. It was still a down year analytically speaking. So like according to like JFresh's player cards, like he. Like his finishing went to like this 0th percentile because he just wasn't like he's flubbing every single shot last season, but it's a small sample size too with the shortened year. But the year before that, he was actually quite a solid player, and I just think it'd be an interesting low risk, high reward swing. So two seasons ago, he was with the Minnesota Wild, and he scored 14 goals and 23 points in 62 games in depth minutes. So you have a 14-goal centerman. At the time, he was 23 years old. I don't know.
Yeah, which is acceptable. For a PTO, you know what? I think you're right because at the same time, if you look a little bit more into Ryan Donato, it might help. He is a product of USHL. He went to Harvard, and then who else went to Harvard? You know, we got Sean Farrell. Who else just graduated from USHL? We got Cole Caulfield. So maybe. Okay, you know what? I take it back, Sebastian. Maybe you're onto something here. That might actually be an interesting pick.
And just to provide some depth, some youth. I mean, Montreal center core is already like young as anything, even with the acquisition of Christian Dvorak. Yeah. But just like one crazy little thing on his on his elite prospects page is that so in 2017-18, it was his final year with Harvard. He didn't do all 4 years there. He signed with the Boston Bruins after only 3 seasons. And in his final year at Harvard, he scored 26 goals in 29 games for 43 points. And then he joined the Boston Bruins and scored 5 goals and 9 points in 12 games. Like, this has nothing to do with his ceiling now because, like, we've seen in the NHL what he is, which is a depth centerman with some goal-scoring upside. but it's kind of crazy to like go straight from college to scoring 9 points in 12 games. That's pretty impressive, and kind of just a little aside there. But yeah,